The rise of a warlord is a story often steeped in violence, conquest, and the clash of armies. But there are exceptions, figures who manage to secure power without drawing a sword or firing a single arrow. One such figure, who defied the expectations of his time, rose to prominence not through military might but through a mastery of diplomacy, intelligence, and psychological warfare. His story is one of ambition, strategy, and the delicate balance between diplomacy and force. Born into relative obscurity, he was a product of a world torn apart by war. A time when kingdoms were constantly at odds, and power was a constant game of shifting alliances, betrayals, and fragile truces. The land he came from had seen its fair share of bloodshed, an ever-changing political landscape marked by dynastic struggles, uprisings, and invasions. But unlike others of his time, this man would not allow himself to be just another soldier caught in the bloody dance of conquest. He understood early on that warfare was not just about battle, it was about perception, manipulation, and the ability to control events without directly confronting enemies. Growing up in such a volatile environment, his education wasn't limited to the arts of war but extended to the intricacies of governance, statecraft, and human psychology. He saw the inner workings of power through his family's connections, observing firsthand how decisions were made, alliances were forged, and enemies were neutralized. It was through these experiences that he learned the value of patience, the power of words, and the subtlety required to shift the tides of fate without ever raising an army. His rise began in the courtrooms and councils of his homeland, where he initially gained influence through his keen understanding of political machinations. But what truly set him apart from other aspiring leaders was his capacity for foresight. He understood that true power didn't lie in the number of soldiers at your disposal or the size of your empire. Instead, it resided in the ability to shape the environment around you, making your enemies come to you, kneel before you, and beg for peace without you ever needing to draw your blade. His genius lay not in the traditional methods of war but in bending others to his will through the art of diplomacy and psychological manipulation. He began to build relationships, not just with the powerful but with those who held influence behind the scenes: merchants, scholars, spies, and even common folk. Through these networks, he created an empire of information. Knowledge, in his mind, was more powerful than any sword. He learned the secrets of his enemies, understood their weaknesses, and used this intelligence to his advantage. And when the time came to act, he would not simply force his will upon them but would instead offer them the illusion of choice, a way to surrender without admitting defeat. Despite the outward peace he maintained, his mind was always working. Every move he made was calculated, every decision deliberate. He would court powerful allies with promises of prosperity, while subtly undermining his enemies, not through open confrontation but through carefully orchestrated shifts in loyalty and trust. His approach was often seen as unorthodox, even deceptive, but it was effective. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell through violence, he achieved something rare: power without bloodshed. But the true test of his method came when the geopolitical landscape shifted. A great empire on the rise posed a direct threat to his people, a military juggernaut that had crushed all who dared stand against it. Many would have rushed into battle, gathering armies and preparing for the inevitable clash. But not this warlord. He saw an opportunity not in conflict but in negotiation. While others readied their swords, he turned his attention to the enemy's leaders, playing on their fears and insecurities, exploiting their weaknesses. What unfolded was a series of subtle maneuvers that, over time, weakened the enemy's resolve without a single battle being fought. At the heart of his strategy was a deep understanding of the human condition. He knew that the greatest battles were not fought on the battlefield but in the minds of men. The psychological warfare he waged was as lethal as any weapon. Fear, doubt, and confusion were his most trusted allies. By spreading rumors, creating distrust among the enemy's ranks, and manipulating the public perception of his adversaries, he slowly but surely isolated them. His enemies began to turn on one another, and what was once a formidable empire began to unravel from within. His strategy was simple yet brilliant. Instead of fighting his enemies, he made them fight themselves. Instead of conquering their lands, he made them surrender their power without ever stepping foot on their soil. And while his enemies were distracted by their own internal conflicts, he continued to build his influence, strengthening his alliances and consolidating his power. When the time came to strike, there was no need for an army. His victory had already been won. However, this kind of power was not without its challenges. As his influence grew, so did the opposition. Those who had once been his allies now began to see his methods as a threat. They questioned his loyalty, his integrity, and the legitimacy of his rise to power. For all his genius, the warlord had made enemies along the way, enemies who now sought to discredit him, to tear down the empire he had built, or perhaps to take his place. And yet, he remained calm. He had anticipated this. In the world of ancient warfare, there was often no greater enemy than time itself. Empires rose and fell not because of military defeat but because of the slow decay that came from within. The warlord understood this, and his rise was not just about avoiding battle, it was about creating a lasting legacy. His method was about endurance, sustainability, and maintaining power long after the noise of war had died down. He knew that power was not a fleeting moment but a continuous process, one that required constant vigilance, patience, and control. As the years went on, his reputation grew. People from across the land whispered his name in awe and fear. Some saw him as a genius, a ruler who had mastered the art of war without ever wielding a sword. Others viewed him as a deceiver, a manipulator who had played his enemies into submission. But whatever they called him, one thing was certain. He was a warlord who had won battles without ever fighting them. And as his empire grew, so did the question that lingered in the hearts of his enemies and allies alike. Was this man truly a ruler of peace, or was he a harbinger of a new kind of war, one fought not with steel, but with the mind? This was the story of a man who defied the conventions of his time, who turned the tables on his adversaries not through force but through cunning, who reshaped the world around him without shedding a drop of blood. His story would be remembered not for the battles he fought, but for the battles he avoided, proving that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who never need to fight at all. As the warlord's influence grew, so too did the challenges he faced. His reputation, forged in the fires of political maneuvering and deft negotiation, began to attract the attention of other powerful figures, some allies, some potential enemies. But the warlord knew that maintaining control was not just about building alliances, it was about ensuring that his enemies never had the chance to rise against him. The war he waged was not a war of arms, but a war of influence, where the battlefield was not the open plains or fortified cities, but the corridors of power, the minds of men, and the delicate web of diplomacy. At this juncture in his rise, the warlord understood that diplomacy wasn't simply a tool of peace, it was the ultimate weapon. The ability to negotiate, to convince, to manipulate with words was what set him apart. Unlike the traditional warlords who relied on overwhelming force and brute strength, he saw diplomacy as the key to maintaining a strategic advantage. By gaining the favor of influential leaders, manipulating public perception, and subtly shifting the balance of power, he could achieve victory without ever drawing his sword. His first true test of this strategy came when a neighboring kingdom, once an ally, began to show signs of aggression. The neighboring kingdom, a vast and well-armed empire, was ruled by a young, ambitious king eager to prove himself. His military was vast, his resources plentiful, and his desire for conquest insatiable. To many, this king appeared as a threat that could not be ignored. Traditional wisdom would dictate that the warlord prepare for war, that he rally his forces and brace for battle. But this was not how the warlord saw it. Rather than preparing for a bloody confrontation, he recognized an opportunity to use the king's ambition against him. The warlord knew that the key to neutralizing this threat wasn't military might, it was the king's ego. The young monarch, in his hunger for glory, sought to expand his empire, believing that war was the only way to achieve true greatness. The warlord, however, saw the cracks in his opponent's strategy, cracks that were hidden beneath the surface. While the king believed he could crush the warlord with force, the warlord knew that if he could manipulate the young king's perception of the world, he could defuse the situation without ever drawing blood. The first step in this process was to make the king question his own alliances. The warlord had built an intricate network of spies and informants, placing them not just within his enemies' ranks, but even among his allies. Through subtle whispers, careful rumors, and the deliberate planting of false information, he began to sow distrust among the king's closest advisors. The warlord knew that if he could erode the king's trust in those around him, he could create a fissure in the kingdom's leadership. And that fissure would be the crack that allowed him to infiltrate the empire without the need for a single confrontation. But the warlord didn't stop there. He recognized that the king's military leaders were an equally important piece of the puzzle. While the king's military prowess was formidable, his generals were often at odds with each other, each vying for the king's favor. Through a series of subtle political maneuvers, the warlord turned these rivalries into full-blown feuds, fueling the divisions within the enemy's ranks. One by one, he eroded the trust between the king and his generals, planting seeds of doubt in their minds about their own leadership and the future of the kingdom. As the young king's enemies within began to multiply, the warlord's influence grew. He used his knowledge of the enemy's internal strife to convince other powerful factions within the neighboring empire to turn against their king. By exploiting the ambitions and fears of those around him, the warlord slowly built a coalition of rival factions, each one eager to see the young king's rule crumble. Meanwhile, the warlord carefully cultivated his own image as a peaceful and reasonable leader, someone who sought harmony rather than conflict, someone willing to negotiate, to mediate, and to find a way to avoid war. In public, the warlord maintained a calm, diplomatic facade. He held councils, met with emissaries, and spoke often of his desire for peace. He made grand gestures of goodwill, offering trade deals, peace treaties, and other incentives to the factions that sought his favor. Behind closed doors, however, he was a master manipulator, pulling the strings of political power with surgical precision. His public diplomacy was a smokescreen, a way to lull his enemies into a false sense of security while he executed his true plan, to make the young king so distrustful and isolated that he would be forced to surrender without a fight. It wasn't long before cracks began to appear in the young king's resolve. The once powerful monarch began to question the loyalty of his own advisors, his generals, and even his people. The warlord's carefully crafted web of manipulation had left the young king paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him. His army began to fracture, his generals fought among themselves, and his court became a breeding ground for rumors and treachery. The warlord, watching from the sidelines, could see that his strategy was working. The kingdom that had once been poised to invade now found itself in disarray, on the brink of collapse, not from an external invasion, but from internal strife. The young king, desperate and unsure of whom to trust, sent emissaries to the warlord, requesting a meeting. The warlord, ever the diplomat, agreed. But when they met, he did not demand that the king surrender or offer threats. Instead, he offered the king an out, an opportunity for peace, for a partnership, for a shared future. With the skill of a seasoned negotiator, the warlord painted a picture of mutual benefit. The young king would avoid the bloodshed of war, while securing alliances that would strengthen his own power. He promised the king that he could help him build an empire not through war, but through peace, persuasion, and strategic alliances. The young king, now worn down by his internal conflicts and the growing suspicion that his rule was unraveling, found himself cornered. The warlord's offer seemed the only way to avoid a catastrophic war that could end in his own downfall. In that moment, the king realized that he had been outplayed, not by a superior army, but by a man who understood the true nature of power. The warlord's victory was not one of brute force, but one of subtlety and intelligence. The king, once full of ambition, was now forced to submit, his empire left to crumble under the weight of its own inner turmoil. The warlord's success in neutralizing this threat without a single battle fought was nothing short of genius. He had shown that the true battlefield was not where soldiers clashed, but in the hearts and minds of leaders. By using diplomacy and psychological warfare, he had achieved a victory that many believed impossible. His enemies, unable to fathom a world where one could win without fighting, were left in awe of his ability to manipulate events, bend men to his will, and emerge victorious without ever raising a sword. As he watched the young king retreat into his crumbling empire, the warlord understood that this victory was just the beginning. He had proven to himself and to the world that war, in the traditional sense, was not the only path to power. The true mastery of warfare lay not in defeating enemies on the battlefield, but in defeating them before they even had the chance to strike. And with this victory, the warlord's place in history was cemented, not as a conqueror of lands, but as a conqueror of men's wills. The time had come for the warlord to face his greatest test yet, one that would challenge his methods and his philosophy. Despite his unmatched success in the art of diplomacy, the political landscape remained volatile. His network of alliances, carefully cultivated over years, was beginning to show signs of strain. While he had avoided conflict with cunning strategy, the growing tensions within his empire and with neighboring powers meant that conflict was no longer an abstract concept. It was a reality he would soon have to confront. This crisis was not one born of his own doing, but it was one that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. A sudden, unforeseen rebellion erupted from within his own ranks. It was not a revolt by common folk or an uprising of peasants, but a well-organized, calculated attempt by discontented military leaders who had begun to resent his unorthodox approach to power. They were veterans of traditional warfare, men who had risen through the ranks on the back of countless battles won and territories conquered. To them, the warlord's rise to power without fighting was an affront to everything they had believed in, and it left them feeling both powerless and humiliated. The warlord's emphasis on diplomacy, his ability to avoid direct confrontations, and his reliance on psychological tactics rather than physical strength had alienated those whose pride was rooted in martial prowess. The rebellion, although not large in scale, was dangerous. It represented a fracture in the warlord's authority that could spread if left unchecked. The military leaders, along with a faction of nobles who felt sidelined by the warlord's rise, began to rally those dissatisfied with his methods. They had been waiting for an opportunity, and now they had found one. The warlord, realizing the gravity of the situation, understood that he was not merely dealing with a rebellion, but a crisis that struck at the very core of his leadership. The rebellion represented a growing faction of traditionalists who were prepared to challenge his philosophy and, in doing so, challenge his right to rule. It was in this moment that the warlord had to reconcile his ideology with the reality of the world around him. His victory had been built on the foundation of avoiding conflict, outwitting his enemies without lifting a sword. But now, his own people, those he had trusted most, had raised arms against him. Would he be forced to abandon his principles and take up arms to defend his rule, or could he once again manipulate the situation, finding a way to quell the uprising without a single drop of blood being shed? As always, the warlord turned to his network of informants. His spies, now deeply embedded within the ranks of the rebellion, provided him with invaluable intelligence. The discontentment among the rebels was not universal. While some sought to overthrow him entirely, others were motivated by more personal grievances or by a desire to restore the traditional ways of the kingdom. The warlord recognized an opportunity. If he could exploit these divisions and sow discord among the rebels themselves, he might not need to engage in a single battle. Rather than confronting them directly, he could divide and conquer, turning their internal struggles into their own downfall. With surgical precision, the warlord began to play the rebel factions against each other. He reached out to the more moderate elements within the rebellion, offering them promises of amnesty, power sharing, and protection if they would betray their more radical counterparts. Simultaneously, he spread rumors among the more hardline rebels, fueling mistrust and paranoia. The moderate faction, unsure of the warlord's true intentions but desperate to find a way to preserve their own power, was quick to distrust their more radical allies. Meanwhile, the radicals, believing they were the true champions of the rebellion, became fixated on rooting out perceived traitors within their ranks. The warlord's actions were, in many ways, an embodiment of his core philosophy. He understood that victory was not always achieved through direct confrontation but through understanding the hearts and minds of those around him. His skill lay not in brute force but in the ability to manipulate the emotions and fears of others. The rebellion, once united in purpose, now began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and rivalry. But this psychological warfare was not without its risks. The warlord knew that if his strategy failed, if the rebels held their ground and remained united, he would be forced into open conflict. If that happened, he would lose the very thing that made him unique, the ability to avoid warfare. The stakes were higher than ever. To some, the idea of winning without fighting seemed impossible. But to the warlord, it was not just a principle, it was his identity. Every decision he made, every move he made, was calculated to preserve the legacy he had worked so hard to create. He could not afford to abandon his ideals, even in the face of rebellion. As the days passed, the internal divisions within the rebellion deepened. The radicals became more aggressive, while the moderates sought to distance themselves from their more extreme counterparts. The warlord's spies reported back with updates, telling him of the growing paranoia within the ranks of the rebels. The moderate faction, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly approached the warlord with an offer of negotiation. They sought peace, not war. They were willing to surrender their arms and swear allegiance to him if he would guarantee them positions of power within the existing structure. The warlord, ever the master of negotiation, agreed to the terms. He did not need to destroy the rebellion through force.